It's my pleasure to introduce Madhav Marathe from UVA, who will be speaking with us to us from the Biocomplexity Institute that just initiated at our university in the past few years. Madhav?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Kevin, Idong, and Vipin, and other organizers for inviting me. I'm going to talk about computational epidemiology and in particular real-time computational epidemiology. I don't think it needs much of an introduction given the events in the last few months. This is a team, and I want to thank the team. The work is certainly not my work by any means. It's the work of a large group of folks as well as our funding agencies. So just before I start, here are some references. I believe the slides are going to go online, and folks who have further interest can take a look at some of these papers. So I'm going to focus on COVID-19 because I think you couldn't find a better example at this point of time for real-time computational epidemiology. And but our group has done work on this area for a while now, and the slides and the papers can talk a little bit more about it as we go along. So COVID-19, for those of you who did not follow from the very early period of the pandemic, we got some early cases, or at least some sniff of it in December. And then by 14th of October, you started getting a much stronger signal that this might become a larger pandemic than we had anticipated. And by mid-March, things were fairly clear that this is not going to abate and just stay in China, basically, and it's going to move all around the world in a fairly significant way. And why did this become a pandemic? As it happens with other diseases, this is a novel virus as far as humans are concerned, so everyone is susceptible. There are very interesting modes of transmission for this virus, including the fact that folks can be transmitting the disease but might be asymptomatic. And finally, where it started and how it started is also important. It started in a very dense part of the world. Not only that, it also started in a part of the world which is very well connected to the world in terms of airline traffic, in terms of other forms of human mobility. In contrast, Ebola, which is also quite deadly, started in Western Africa, and it's not so well connected to the rest of the world. So it was relatively easier to control it at the start. The social and political response has been amazing. We've probably lost more than $3 or $4 trillion by now. Just US has invested over $3 trillion in this. And you've seen a slew of papers. So people have reported between 6,000 and 20,000 scientific articles and preprints on this topic. So it's just everything about this whole pandemic is quite unique in a certain sense. So we at the Institute have been working on this general problem for a long time now. We've been doing epidemic modeling for 20 plus years, I would say closer to 25 years now. And we have supported the US government as well as state and local governments and international authorities throughout the last 20 years on larger pandemics. We participate in the H5N1 scare. We then participated and actively played a role in the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. We were also part of a large team that supported the DoD and other federal authorities during the 2014 Ebola outbreak, and then finally the Zika outbreak. So we started tracking this in December, and the work formally began in January, I would say somewhere middle of January. And about 80 of us, including staff, students, and full-time scientists, work on this. These are folks here at UVA, but also our collaborating institution. It's a very massive effort. We directly support policy analytics. For the DoD, we provide input to CDC through various mechanisms. We are the primary modeling group for our state and work with the Virginia Department of Health and Virginia Department of Emergency Management. And we also provide science-based evidence and analysis of policies for our universities and local hospital systems in the state. And as you'll see as we go along, this has led to substantial advances in this particular topic of computational epidemiology. So what we would like to do in the long run is what I call P-cubed analytics, basically. And this applies not just to epidemiology, but massive biosocial systems. We want to build systems that are pervasive. We want to build systems that have ability to do personalized decision-making. And you want this to be precise. And there are a couple of interesting papers. There's a nice article in Science during the H1N1 outbreak by Feinberg and his colleague Wilson, which was titled Epidemic Science in Real Time, very beautifully done. There's also an article by Dirk Helbing in general for network systems that I would encourage folks to take a look at, and talks about systemic risk and how system models would be useful. I want to point out the NSF just awarded us a very large project called the Expeditions Project to study this further. And we hope to continue this work for the next 5 years as we go along. So we are not the first to do modeling for epidemics, of course. This whole thing started in 1700 with Bernoulli's work for smallpox. And in the last 100+ years, the class of model that has been very useful is called the compartmental mass action models. It's a fairly simple and straightforward model, but very, very useful. You take the population and divide into, in this particular example here, 3 compartments, but 3 is just a number. You could divide it into more compartments if needed. S stands for susceptible, I stands for infected, and R stands for recovered. You can again have S there so that you become susceptible again, as it happens in certain diseases. And the basic idea is to write a set of differential equations, which are basically mass action models, and tell you how the rate of density of susceptible infected boxes or compartments would change as as the compartments interact. And from this simple model, which is the workhorse for epidemiology and very, very valuable, you can get important quantities like when the disease peaks, the time to take off, the peak value, the total number of people who might get infected. 2 big quantities that everybody must have read by now is herd immunity, which is getting a lot of attention, and I'll have more to say later on, maybe in a couple of weeks. And also the notion of R0, or effective reproductive number, both of which are important quantities that epidemiologists have studied and are used to guide their decisions. So as much as these models have been useful, there is a certain amount of shortcomings, or shall I say, something left to be desired, which is that they don't capture the heterogeneity of the system, right? And the approach that I would like to outline today is one that I'm calling it networked epidemiology, to studying epidemic processes on multi-scale social contact networks. And the idea and the hypothesis is that a realistic representation of the underlying network and the behavioral adaptation yields better insights into the contagion dynamics. And this basic idea of a representation theory was outlined in Professor Shehu's talk today as well, and also in Tandy's talk in the morning. So in some ways, this is not new. It's just applied to a kind of problem that we are working on. So the basic idea is very, very simple again. You have, just like the models that I talked about in ODE case, 3 states. A node can be, so you take a graph. Each node can be in one of the 3 states: susceptible, infected, recovered. The edge labels denote the transmission probability. And in this case, the node red is initially infected, tries to infect V1 and V3 and V2 independently with probability half. And this shows you the time sequence of what happens. So V0 ends up infecting V1 and V2, but not V3. And then V1 and V2 infect V4 and V6. And then finally, V6 infects V3. And then the epidemic stops in this case. So you can write down a sequence of configurations that the system goes through, which is very nicely captured by a Markov chain, where you have, in this case, a node where you start it, so shown in the middle, and then you have edges going from one configuration to another, and the label on the edge is a probability that you transition from one of these super nodes, so to say, or configuration node to another configuration. So in that sense, it doesn't look very different as far as computer scientists are concerned, what one would have when you represent a probabilistic Turing machine, almost identical. As it happens there, the problem lies in the fact that this Markov chain is exponentially larger than the network itself. So even if each node has 3 states, a chain like this would have, and there are n nodes, you would get a chain of size 3 to the n. And this is just a start of the complexity of the problem. So, and most of the analysis problem is not to be done on the base network at all, but on the Markov chain itself. So an output of this effort is called a dendogram. And a dendogram represents how the disease progress. In this case, V naught is going to infect V1, V2, and V2 infected V4, V6, and V6 infected V3. And this is shown in a tree-like form in the bottom right corner of the screen, and picks up the basic transmission in a certain sense. So think of this as stain. People do this in neuroscience where they put a stain and then look at which part of neurons light up. There's not conceptually something similar is happening here. You have a stain and it stains certain nodes, and this tells you how the nodes get stained. Provably, the problem is actually very hard. It's number P hard, and so we start to use simulations to try and understand these systems. The problem is what I've talked about till now is about epidemic simulation, how the disease spread. The problem becomes even harder when we start talking about interventions. And one of the most common interventions that all of you have now read endlessly in newspapers is one of social distancing. That's the only way you can control COVID-19 right now. And the basic idea is you want to reduce social contacts to try and reduce the spread while also minimizing the economic and social impact. So here's an example of what a social distancing would mean in our toy example that I showed you before. So let's start from left top and then go around. So the first issue is, how do you intervene? So when do you intervene and for how long do you intervene? So in this case, V0, V1, and V2, you can intervene, so take them off, and you're going to lift the intervention in this case at time t plus delta. The second thing on the top says, who do you intervene and how do you intervene? So you can either close workplaces in this case, or isolate the nodes or quarantine the nodes. And isolation quarantine is different. In case of isolation, you isolate the folks who are sick. Quarantine denotes isolating individuals who have come in social proximity of the infected individuals, but they might not be sick themselves. And then you talk about the pulsing strategy, where you close the place for a while and social distance for a while, then you open and then you social distance again. This is a strategy that was discussed in Neil Ferguson's paper as well, and others have studied, but I would not have ever thought that this would be taken seriously because it's very, very expensive to do it. But you can see that a version of this is really playing out as we try and control the COVID pandemic. So as I've argued, hopefully so far, it's building computer models and simulations really are the only way to solve realistic versions of this problem. And in the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you how we go about doing this. There's a lot of theoretical work as well. I've tried to skip that. The papers and the tutorials that I have referenced early on has all the details that you would like to look at. So the way we go about doing this, and which I think is novel in a certain sense, is to do this study of epidemic processes on networks in 3 steps. So if you want to study how the disease is spreading in, say, Washington, DC or Charlottesville, then the first step is to build a digital twin of that city. And to do that, you combine various information that is thrown at you, census, roadways, building locations, travel diaries, and build out a digital representation of it. And what you get from this is a network. And the intended meaning of this digital twin is that you have a representation of the city or the region that you're interested in that is statistically very similar to the region you want to study. But none of the agents have any sense of direct one-to-one correspondence with individuals living in the city. And the papers will make this very clear of what statistical similarity means. I won't go through it here. But effectively, such a system provides a social coordinate system for understanding how cities are built out. So here's a cartoon of how we do it. We take census information, we take travel diaries, we take road information, we take digital traces, we take flow data from various devices as whenever we get handle on, and build out essentially what we call a people location bipartite graph, which is on the right side of your screen. On the left part of that bipartite graph are individuals with lots of labels, and on the right side are locations with labels. And effectively, a person, if he visits a location L, the person has an edge from person node to the location node, and the edge also has a number of different attributes. So this is the graph you end up generating. This is the social contact network. It's a people location graph from which you can do a projection on the people side to get a people-people interaction graph. And that is the network that we are talking about, and we will use throughout our study in doing this. So this is a very interesting big data problem. It's been a while. We've been working at this, as I said, close to 25 years. And there's no real stopping criteria in the sense that these things get better and better as new data sets come in. We have now built out such a digital representation for the entire US, and we will release versions of it in time. So the second step is to build agent-based models that understand how diseases spread on these networks. It turns out that you need HPC-like systems to do anything meaningful with this because they're fairly complicated. And here is an example of how disease manifests itself in a single person. I showed you a simple model, which was SI and R. In the real world, it turns out the models are much, much more complicated. So here's a model we use for a single individual when we study COVID. It has got about 15 states and captures a lot of interesting structural aspects about asymptomatic and symptomatic. When do they need medical attention? When can they get hospitalized? How can they recover? And all of this information is picked up. This is for folks who have done formal work, it can be best cast as a probabilistic time transition system. So transition in this probabilistic automata are both timed and are probabilistic. And you have one such automata for every individual in the population, right? And the transitions in this automata are dependent on the interaction that the individuals have with each other. So here's a simulation that we performed some time back with Sanjay at UIUC and his student Abhinav and a number of other folks at Livermore in our group. And this was actually a non-trivial task where we could simulate epidemic spread. This time it was influenza through the entire US using the cluster at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. Prabhat was very helpful in getting us those machines. And we could run this in about 8 to 9 seconds on 800,000 plus scores. And this is needed if you start doing analytics with it. So the third step is to build workflows because that's really what is needed to finally do decision support. So you want to solve using these workflows questions like forecasting, analyzing different interventions, doing economic impact, studying inverse problems like finding out patient zero, inferring various transmission probabilities, computing the risk of individuals as well as a collection of groups, and looking at the attack rate. So what we have done over the last 4 months for COVID is we have built out a number of different dashboards to support decision makers. One that is quite popular and probably second to the Johns Hopkins dashboard is a surveillance dashboard that we built early on. Very similar in its form and content, but a few different features than Johns Hopkins dashboard that many of you, I'm sure, know. We built out another dashboard for our state to tell them how the medical resources are going to be used in the state in the next few weeks. The basic dashboard is generalizable to US. We are working on the models to drive it, but it tells hospital systems in the state when they can expect the bed capacities to to be overshot if the disease continues on the path that it is on. On the left below, we have produced what's called contact matrices. A lot of epidemiologists have interest in it that tell you how individuals interact with each other, and you can build these social contact networks from it. And the fourth one at the bottom is a joint effort with Stanford, Michael Bernstein's group, and Jacob is, I believe, leading that effort there. But we're building a crowdsourced platform to collect various social distancing measures counties in US are putting together. And this has been challenging, actually. We thought we could quickly do this at the peak of the epidemic in March, April, in about a month, and we are still far away. It's not straightforward to get this data. It's not straightforward to make sure it's correct and update it all the time. We've also built decision support systems, and I will say a little bit about it. On the top left, we did a study, and this is on medRxiv, it's under review. We studied early on how would the disease make its way to other countries once it starts to move out of China. And we could do a reasonably good job on predicting this, what's called importation risk. On the right side is our weekly projection for our state. We do a fairly detailed analysis, and this data is available on state website every week after we are done. So you can find today's update that we gave them just now in an hour back on VDH website by Monday or so. And this tells you every week where the state's sort of numbers are and where they're likely to go in the next 2 to 4 weeks. We have steadfastly avoided making long-term projections because I personally think they're meaningless, and I'll say a little bit about why. This is a question, though, everybody's interested in, from news reporters to policymakers to scientists. The problem is that unlike physical systems or even systems such as weather, where the error in the forecast is largely because, in a physical system like predicting the movement of moon or other planets, the error is very limited. In case of weather, you can argue that most of the problems arise because we don't have absolutely accurate representation of the model, or at least not enough time to solve those equations with the precision that we want. But we understand the physics quite well, we would argue. Here, the problem, and this is true for every socioeconomic system, is that predictions become endogenous to the system. So our predictions, and even without predictions, people's perception of the disease and their risk-seeking abilities define what they would act in the next few weeks. So a prediction that shows the numbers to go skyrocket upwards might never turn out to be true, and oftentimes do not, because most of the time these predictions lead to people taking preventive behavioral measures that change their behavior, and then the numbers come down. This happens all the time in such systems, and so it becomes non-trivial to forecasts which are way ahead. You can do a forecast for a couple of weeks with reasonably good accuracy, at least in some cases, if the data starts becoming available. At the bottom left, we have a paper with Google now using flow data that we got from Google. This is a flow data that Google collects. It's anonymized aggregate data based on digital devices and tells you what flows exist between any two patches in the world, and these patches are roughly 2 square kilometers big. So if you take a patch IJ in this global grid and you have another patch KL, then this tells you the flow and the human mobility flow, normalized and aggregated, anonymized, but still has a lot of information in a certain sense. And the plot will show you how these flows are able to capture global change in mobility around March 15th or so. And something interesting happened. The government orders came around 15th of March and a little later in most places. But the events in Italy and the events that were starting to unfold in New York actually had people change their behavior even slightly earlier. So this basically tries to tell you how policies can impact individual behavior, or especially their own perception of risk would impact their behavior. The paper actually goes further and does retrospective analysis of what would have happened if you had delayed these lockdowns, as they're called. So I'll quickly spend time, last few minutes, maybe.
Madhav, just to warn you, you're at time through the questions.
So that's very good. So let's skip this. We have a Bayesian ensemble. Let me just summarize, as Kevin said. What I want to let you know is real-time epidemiology is indeed possible. And the role of models should go beyond predictions and structured understanding. And finally, social, economic, and political dimensions are actually becoming increasingly important as we understand epidemiology. So this is not just a problem of virus spreading between two individuals, but hugely affected by these considerations. So I'll stop there, Kevin, and take questions. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. I saw one question on Slido related to earlier in your talk about some of the Markov chain analyses and things. You gave a nice example of how quarantine might be encoded isolation. And the question related to how would you encode masking, facial coverings and things, because would you randomly reduce probabilities through the network, or are there other strategies for that?
It's a very good question. So like all the other talks you've heard so far, data becomes a real challenge. So now there is some information on masks, but if you look at the survey that New York Times and other agencies did recently on mask coverings, you still get an aggregate number, right? And this number, of course, changes in time. So the model provides you with the flexibility of deciding how to put it in, but the way you represent it finally will affect the dynamics. So you end up trying to do the best you can with the data you have. And in this particular case, we would take certain average values, hopefully broken down by age groups, which is very, very important. We know that it matters. And spatially as well, you know that certain parts are much more compliant in the US than other parts, at least that's what the numbers suggest. And then to use the best and then do uncertainty quantification over it. We are doing a similar analysis for campus reopening, just for folks who might be interested, and we'll release a report in the next 2 days. It's actually quite interesting what might happen as campuses start to reopen or not.
All right, excellent. Thanks very much.
Thanks.